Hello and welcome to today's episode of Comms Business Live, where we're joined by Matthew Davies, Business Development Manager for Digital Products and Services at Memco, a brand of Avire, to talk about how to successfully transition emergency communication systems in lifts to all IP networks ahead of the PSTN switch-off. In this session, we're going to discuss the following: the impact of the PSTN switch-off on lift emergency communication systems, insights from the field on the current transition strategies and common pitfalls, key technical and regulatory considerations for ensuring compliance and safety, modern technology solutions including GSM, IP-based systems, and managed services such as Avire's Sentinel, and the role communications providers can play in enabling seamless transitions and the potential for new revenue streams. So first of all, Matthew, can I just ask you, what does the PSTN switch-off mean for lift emergency communication systems, and what are the key risks of doing nothing about it?
Thanks, Alex. So in the UK, we have around about 310,000 passenger carrying lifts. Now, we have a very good implementation here of two-way voice alarms. So that's an alarm which is on the lift, and it is to be used when the lift stops in the shaft, effectively trapping a passenger. Now, obviously, a lift entrapment is not a pleasant situation to be in, but for that passenger, being in the lift car is the safest place. Now, our concerns around the PSTN switch off are that traditionally an analog alarm device has been provisioned on the car, and then an analog telephone line has been run to that device so that it can communicate with the outside world. As we move into the all IP area, we really have two core concerns. The first is the ongoing support for analog signaling. So most lift alarms will use what's called dual tone modulating frequency, DTMF, as its machine to machine communication means. This is an analog medium. Most people would possibly know it as a system called touch tone. Not all digital lines offer the support for that. So there is a mismatch issue we can see where a digital line will simply block a lift alarm from working. Our much bigger concern, though, is power resilience. So when we had an analog copper line, that line carried its own power. It was separate from the mains power grid in the building or in the local area. So it was actually quite difficult and quite an extreme situation to get a true failure on an analog line. Typically, the copper cable itself had to be physically broken. As we move into the all IP world, digital telephone lines will typically consist of a number of different pieces of equipment to support them, all of which rely on the mains power in the building. So our concern is a mains power fail, which is a key time to potentially have a lift trapping, because you may cut power to the lift as well. You can also now be in a situation where you've lost your telephone line, so that alarm won't be able to dial out. And then we have the situation that we want to avoid at all costs, which is somebody trapped in a lift who then cannot communicate with the outside world.
I see. Okay then. And what key lessons have you learned from recent migrations that you've done?
So I think what we've seen is a few core things. I think first of all, a lot of the end clients we've dealt with, first of all, had a fairly low awareness of what was going on around the PSTN switch off. We still encounter clients who it's a surprise to them, and this is a program which has been going on since 2018. The second piece is the difficulty that clients have in identifying their lift lines. Lift lines are notorious for being very low usage. It's a line that you only use when you really need it. Lift alarms will run or should run a test every 3 days, so you may well see that. So the first piece is how a client identifies that line, and secondly, it's their understanding of the lift alarm application. There's a lot of different solutions out there. One of the things we have seen is clients who've been caught out where copper telephone lines have already been transitioned to digital. They haven't fully appreciated what's going on. In some cases, they're not even fully aware their lines were being transitioned. And in the extreme cases, we have seen whole sites where every lift alarm has just as far as the client's concerned, suddenly stopped working. We've been then called in to do a site survey, and we have to say to them, look, your lift alarms are still in good working order, but because your telephone line has changed, you no longer have the communication means to get to the outside world. The other thing that we are seeing increasingly in the lift industry is a resource crunch. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done. Of the 310,000 lifts that I mentioned earlier, we estimate maybe 200,000 of those still need to be transitioned or have been transitioned to a digital solution and are now starting to cause a problem. So, lift companies and lift engineers have all of the lift maintenance, lift repair, freeing trapped passengers that we would normally do, but there's potentially this weight of work on top. The other thing that we have started to do is work quite closely with communication providers, because we have seen communication providers be ready to transition a whole client's portfolio. So all of the internet lines, all of the telephone lines, and the lifts suddenly become a blocker because they don't have a suitable solution, or they don't have a solution where they're comfortable with the risk profile. And all of a sudden, a major transition project that you may have worked on for a year, 2 years, suddenly grinds to a halt whilst you try and find something which will be able to serve those lift alarms.
Okay. And how have you successfully managed to meet the regulatory and technical requirements for modernizing lift communications within this process?
So the PSTN switch off in the UK, digital switch as it's sometimes referred to, is the third that we as Memco have worked on. So we were involved with the national broadband network rollout in Australia back in 2017. So that was the name given to their PSTN switch off. And we also worked in Switzerland in 2019 when Switzerland went through the same thing. So much smaller countries compared to the UK, but it allowed us to learn a lot of important lessons there. So the first thing I would say is, in both cases, those markets, the lift industry transitioned almost completely away from fixed telephone lines. Nobody could find, and I think really nobody could guarantee, a solution where they were comfortable with the power resilience. So making sure that that digital line has a power backup, so it is working in a power fail when you potentially most need it. No one was really comfortable with that. So there was a mass migration over to the mobile network. The mobile network obviously has its own power considerations, but the key difference here was the ability to provision a mobile gateway which had an onboard monitored battery, and the gateway itself could be monitored. So we're moving from a world where there was always an assumption that the copper line was going to be there, into a world now where really you need an understanding of the status of that connection. So, firstly, we have a 4G gateway, and the industry recommendation. So the Lift and Escalator Industry Association have guidance on their website that can be viewed. The industry recommendation is to move away from a fixed line and onto a 4G mobile gateway. That gateway should have an onboard battery. The minimum we would recommend is an hour. That's in line with the backup requirements which are put on lift alarms. Typically, we as an industry will overspec our battery backups. So really, I think clients should be looking for something with a 4-hour backup as a minimum. But it's also about understanding the mobile signal profile on your site. One of the things we have found when we've worked with some customers to transition them is we've had a conversation where we've said, which of your locations have poor mobile signal? And often we are working with a telecoms team or an M&E team who won't necessarily have visibility on something like poor mobile signal, because that usually gets reported in things like tenant satisfaction surveys, guest satisfaction surveys. We've said to clients in the hospitality space, can you look at your TripAdvisor reviews and tell us which of your sites are criticized for having bad mobile signal? Because really what you want to do is pre-survey that site, understand what the mobile signal profile is, and then potentially look to provision higher gain antennas, directional antennas. The other thing that we are very, very mindful of is often the quickest way to fit a gateway onto a lift is to fit it on top of the lift car. is probably the worst place in terms of a signal hostile environment. You're on top of the lift car sits inside 4 big steel guide rails. That all sits in a concrete shaft, and that shaft will often sit right at the core of your building. So we've worked also in the lift industry to train people to say, when you're installing these gateways, they need to be at the top of the lift shaft or in the lift motor room if one exists, or even on the control panel, which will typically sit on the landing on the top floor of the building, to really maximize that potential for signal. So, we've worked across really all sides of this. To make sure people understand what's needed, what's really best practice, and then once you're into that, how you can deploy these things in an effective way.
Okay. And in terms of the technology itself, what key solutions are available to make the transition, and how do they compare in terms of their viability and effectiveness?
So obviously, I've spoken there quite a lot about mobile gateways. If you have a digital line and it has some form of battery backup, I have no problem with that as a solution when it goes in day one. A fully configured, correctly set up battery backup should be no problem. Our concerns are day 2 through to the point where that battery needs to be changed. So really with these, a lot of what's being thought about at the moment is, how does that digital line go in on day 1? Okay, fine, that's sorted. How is that battery backup now maintained, managed, and ultimately how is it monitored? Most of what I have seen requires a direct visual inspection, i.e. somebody needs to go and look at it and look at status LEDs on the front of that unit. If you have on-site staff, then potentially that's something that can be put into daily maintenance checks. If you don't have on-site staff, it's really thinking about, how can I get somebody to that location, or how can I understand the status of that battery backup? Because there's a real danger here that we put things in on day 1, and we're all very happy with that and it's all working fine. But then either there is an issue where the battery ultimately reaches its end of its life, or we have seen examples where people will unknowingly unplug a battery backup, not realizing what it's for, and essentially invalidate that backup onto that digital line. So that's the digital phone line solution piece. When it comes to provisioning gateways, there are multiple routes here, but again, it's understanding, is that gateway fit for purpose, i.e., can it support the analog signaling needs of your lift alarm, and does it have a battery backup? If it does, what's then again your maintenance management and monitoring solution once it's in? Lift companies can directly provision gateways. Typically, they will use something which has been designed for the lift industry, so that will have the analog signaling support, that will have the battery backups. But again, it's about understanding, okay, you can supply and fit this for me, but how do we manage it when it's in life? And then lastly, there's the managed service option based on a mobile gateway. You'd alluded to our Sentinel service, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Provisioning of a battery-backed gateway, but then with a service element whereby you understand, how is that being managed, how is that being monitored, and how do we deal with faults? The other point to bring out here is, if you do choose to go the mobile gateway route, you do need to think about the technology which is being provisioned. In October this year, we are going to see the beginning of the 2G shutdown in the UK, when Virgin Media O2 cancels inbound roaming onto their 2G network. That's going to be the first domino of many that are going to fall, which are ultimately going to lead to the 2G network going away in the UK. So if somebody offers you a cheap 2G gateway, it is cheap for a reason. It won't work for that long. So you need to think about that. But even a 4G gateway, which ultimately today is your best option when it comes to mobile coverage in the UK, and the ability of that mobile signal to penetrate into the building, 4G is not going to be around forever. I think we've had something like 127 years on the analog telephone network. We've had 34 years of 2G. We're not going to have that on 4G. The best example to use there is 3G. which was introduced after 2G and has already been taken away, the technology horizons are going to pull in. Again, with a fully managed service option, it's on us as your service provider, to upgrade those gateways as the communication network changes, because these horizons will now come up every few years as the consumer mobile network, and that's what drives mobile network infrastructure. But as that consumer need changes, we are going to see these technology changes, and clients need to be ready for that.
Okay. And from a communications provider perspective, how can they best support their clients and really differentiate the services that they offer and tap into new markets as a result of the switchover?
So first and foremost, ask your clients if they have lifts. We make the got lifts joke. Because it's not always an application that people are particularly cognizant of. We're essentially a niche of a niche within the alarm space. So you understand from your clients, do you have lifts? Are any of your telephone lines serving those lifts today? Work with the client to audit those lines and identify the ones which are serving lifts. You can also at this point, and it is a good idea to try and loop in the lift maintainer, so that they can give you an understanding of the equipment that's on the lift. But then you really look at what's the compatibility of the solution you're looking to provision, and also what are your options. We partner quite closely with communication providers, because this is an opportunity both to retain lift lines that you currently have in place. Don't lose that connectivity as you're making this transition. And look to provision something which, as I say, is fit for industry purpose around those considerations of how is that backup power, that power resilience piece to your solution being managed once it's gone in. And I think there is a risk here that communication providers today are managing all of the connectivity into the building. But as we go through the PSTN switch off, and as you hit these niche applications, your portfolio may well get chipped away at. So having a solution which you can say, yes, I can fulfill that application need. And then also when you're talking to new clients, they may be having these issues with these niche applications. And again, you can highlight, look, I am able to do that for you.
Okay. And just finally, what is your key message or takeaway for MSPs and resellers who are looking to move their customers across in the transition?
So it's fully understand the application that you are transitioning. Ultimately, we need to get all of these lines moved, but there is something on the end of those lines, and that thing will have very different needs. When it comes to lift alarms, work with your clients to audit the lines, and then make sure that the solution you are accepting for those lines has that analog support, has that power resilience, and ultimately has that management, monitoring, maintenance piece, so that whatever you provision today is good for the lifetime of that connection and doesn't introduce additional risk into an application where, in its worst instance, if somebody is trapped in a lift and they cannot signal for help and they try and free themselves, that's where we see injuries, that's where we see fatalities, and that is really what we want to avoid as an industry.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your time,
Thank you,
Matthew,
Alex.
and thank you everyone for listening.